Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The arrival of Ambassador Mi셸s틸 has raised expectations for a new chapter in U.S. Korea relations. Just days after taking up her post, she met with Foreign Minister Cho Hyun for wide-ranging talks, signaling that key bilateral issues are already moving on the forefront. Now, at the same time, there are signs of renewed diplomatic activity with China. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is expected to visit Seoul later this month as the Korean government also steps up multilateral diplomacy in hopes for creating momentum for dialogue with North Korea. So with Washington and Beijing both stepping up engagement with Seoul, what could these developments mean for Korea's foreign policy and security? For more on this, we are joined in the studio by Kim Mok-yeon, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Strategy. A very big welcome, Dr. Go.
Good to be with you.
And also joining us is Mark Barry, Associate Editor Emeritus at the International Journal on World Peace. Good to see you again.
And good to see you again.
So let's start a discussion right away. First with Dr. Go, of course, with Ambassador Mi셸s틸. What does her appointment first mean for the U.S.-Korea alliance?
Well, it clearly represents a closing of a chapter. So South Korea didn't have a sitting U.S. ambassador for 18 months. So last time South Korea had an ambassador was in January 2025. But when the Ambassador Goldberg left the country, he wasn't replaced by anyone. In fact, the bilateral relations between the two countries was, in a way, represented by an acting ambassador on the U.S. side for more than a year. So it's actually a good thing that we have finally turned the corner and then have an ambassador who's in fact has a wide network in the U.S. Congress, which is going to be a very important player when it comes to implementing the joint factions. And also she's actually Korean American, and I think it actually represents a very benign, friendly face to the Korean public. So in a way, I think it's a high point of U.S. public diplomacy in Korea. But having said that, I mean, everything this represents the Korea-facing side of this appointment. But there's also another aspect to this, which is, in a way, more substantial. So Ambassador still comes to Seoul with an agenda. In fact, there's no agenda in the sense that it's nothing secretive or anything. It's in fact she has a mission, and the mission is the implementing the Korean side, the joint faction, essentially what Korea has to deliver to U.S. side based on the agreement that the two U.S. and Korean leaders reached back in October 2025 in Gyeongju. So in that, South Korea promised to the United States, for instance, not to discriminate against U.S. firms, especially when it comes to digital platforms. So, and that actually puts on the table two major issues, which one is the Coupang issue. So Coupang is a retail company in Korea, but it's actually based in the United States. So it has been under scrutiny and investigation by the Korean side for violation of personal data privacy protections. So, and also there's access to the sensitive data by Google, a very important online platform. So, and Ambassador still wants to essentially support U.S. economic interest here and against some sort of friction that's actually epitomized by the Coupang issue that's going on right now. So I think this also represents a point of friction between Washington and Seoul, and I think Ambassador still will have a lot on our hands.
Right, both anticipation and also concern with her latest appearance. But looking deeper at Ambassador Stilh, she's a former politician rather than a career diplomat. Dr. Barry, how could that shape her role in Seoul?
Well, you know, first of all, she's not just the second Korean American, she's the second woman to be a U.S. ambassador to Seoul. And I think that that, in my mind, means she doesn't have to let men define her role. I think she's going to have to approach a very difficult situation of a Washington administration that is much less sensitive to its allies than any previous administration in memory, and handle it with a woman's intuition and great dexterity, great sensitivity. Also, this may be her last career position, although it's possible she could step down a little bit early and run for Congress again in 2028, depending on what will happen. But she'll have to abandon any concepts that she's already had when she was an Orange County supervisor and her 2 terms in Congress, and deal with realities on both sides in a fair and balanced manner. And she'll have to earn the Korean public's respect, because she may have a few months of honeymoon period, but when the going gets tough, which it will, she's going to have to be seen as extremely fair and extremely balanced.
Right. Certainly, as Dr. Go said, she would have a lot on her table moving forward. But if we build on that, Dr. Berry, Ambassador Steele recently met with Foreign Minister Cho Hyun for wide-ranging talks. Do you expect her to take a firm America First approach on issues like defense cost sharing and tariffs? And also, how should Seoul respond to those?
I see her as a traditional conservative Orange County Republican. And she is not connected to Trump's inner circles. And I think it's incorrect for mass media to indicate that she has a strong connection to the White House. She does not. The true inner circles for President Trump consist of billionaires and loyalists from West Palm Beach and New York City. However, I will say that during her last congressional campaign, Michelle got a lot of funding from Elon Musk. So she does have a connection with the cryptocurrency scene in the United States, which is not surprising. But nonetheless, she's going to have to endeavor to explain Trump administration policy, even though it's oftentimes very changeable and sometimes very contradictory, even within different departments in the U.S. cabinet. If she insensitively echoes Trump rhetoric and demands, it's going to backfire, and the Lee administration may decide to largely but very politely cut her off. Also, one of her challenges in coming weeks, in my view, may be Trump administration criticism on the topic of religious freedom, because we're approaching the September 5th first anniversary of Charlie Kirk's death, days after meeting pastors in Seoul and Busan. And also we have pending judicial decisions regarding indicted non-mainstream so-called Korean religious figures. And this is a subject that was brought up by White House Faith Office advisor Paula White, whose office is in the West Wing, and she met for almost an hour with then Prime Minister Kim, and then escorted him unexpectedly and by surprise to a 20-minute Oval Office meeting with President Trump. So this is something that Ambassador Ambassador Steele will have her hands full of, because she can't avoid that issue. It's going to be a hot issue in the U.S. and how it's perceived in South Korea.
Right, quite a lot of controversial and sensitive issues that has to be tackled right now. But what about North Korea, issues on North Korea? Dr. Go, Ambassador Steele has been outspoken on North Korean human rights issues and also skeptical of the end war declaration. How do you think that could affect future U.S. Korea coordination?
Well, so Ambassador Steele is on the record for having protested or opposed the signing of the end of a war declaration, and when she was a tenured member of the U.S. Congress. But then that was in 2021, and then it was a different president in Korea. There was President Moon Jae-in, and then unlike President Moon Jae-in, the current president Lee Jae-myung, he's not placing that much weight on the end of the war declaration. Back in 2021, President Moon essentially had placed all the weight, or say, like all his political capital in the end of war declaration as a way to propel the inter-Korean engagement forward. Right now, that's not the case at all, and partly because North Korea is not reciprocating or engaging with the South at the moment. So, so her record of having opposed the end of war declaration is not going to be an issue. But then, on the other hand, what could be an issue is that her emphasis on the North Korean human rights records. So that's more of a sticky issue because that's besides the security dialogue that Seoul Pyongyang and Washington could establish. So, but then the human rights issue, in fact, it's going to be a more challenging issue to overcome, because once you depict the other side as a mass human rights violator or like engage in crimes against humanity, it really makes it very difficult to engage in diplomatic channel. So, so that's going to could be a sticking point for North Korea, especially because North Korea is very defensive when it comes to the defending its own human rights record. So, and her background as the child of so the refugees from North Korea who eventually relocated to the United States, is going to color her interaction not just with North Korea but also with South Korea. The South Korean government clearly, even though it's not putting emphasis on Indo-War declaration, but on the other hand, is putting a lot of weight on the inter-Korean engagement, which we're going to discuss later. So in that sense, I think she's will have to accommodate not just her instincts or her record as a very strong hardliner when it came to North Korea, but also the fact that she's not just in a country that's actually pursuing resumption of engagement with North Korea, but also represents an administration that is also interested in engaging North Korea. So I think she's going to be, very flexible in a way when it comes to North Korea against some concerns that we have based on her background and experience and records.
So we'll have to see how her personal views would really affect policies moving forward. But beyond North Korea, then she's also taking a firm line on China as well. Dr. Berry, could Washington press Seoul to do more on China at this point? And how should Korea balance the two?
Let me, first of all, add to what Dr. Go just said. You know, President Trump has said a zillion times in this second term that I have a good relationship with Kim Jong-un, and I'm looking forward, I hope to meet him again in the near future. And that is his policy, and no one can contradict that. So I think Ambassador Steele has to walk a fine line of being tough on North Korea and maintaining a denuclearization policy, but at the same time giving that freedom of room for President Trump to pull a rabbit out of his hat, which may or may not happen in this term. But in terms of China, what I see is that you know, the pressure that you're speaking of is really not going to come from her. It's going to come from the cabinet members like Treasury Secretary Bessent, Commerce Secretary Lutnick, et cetera. Those are the people who articulate on behalf of their departments their objections to any tendencies that they see in South Korea or a certain towing of the line that they want to see. And I think Ambassador Steele's job is to very gently re-articulate that and phrase it in a way that is as acceptable and polite as possible. But if it's still somehow taken rather offensively by the Lee government, then Seoul can always respond by politely making her irrelevant.
So definitely we'll have to see how much will change under her new position. But let's shift gears a little bit, Dr. Go. China's Wang Yi is expected to visit Seoul later this month. When he comes, what kind of message do you think would Beijing likely to send?
So I think it's really about optics, like all diplomatic engagements with China. So Foreign Minister Wang Yi is visiting South Korea. I mean, in a way, it represents, it symbolizes the full normalization of restoration relations between Seoul and Beijing. So Foreign Minister Wang Yi had visited Seoul before, but then this is in a way represents like a high point in the bilateral relations between China and South Korea, which actually resumed after President Xi of China had come to Korea last year on the occasion of the APEC summit, but also President Lee's reciprocal visit to Beijing earlier this year. But then we have to also, besides the symbolics, there was also taking into consideration the bigger picture, especially the security picture in Northeast Asia. So Foreign Minister Wang Yi is coming to Seoul as a counterbalance to the rapid rapprochement between Seoul and Tokyo that's taking place at the moment. So, Wang Yi is coming to Seoul right now, but then I think in a way this visit is in response to Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi's visit to Korea in May this year. So And then, because the relationship between Beijing and Tokyo is at the very bottom right now, I think there's the concern on the part of Beijing that if China allows South Korea to deepen its not just bilateral relations when it comes to diplomatic cooperation, but also this diplomatic cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo is increasingly tending towards military cooperation. And this, if this is allowed to happen, then on the whole, it's going to represent a major pressure on Beijing. So I think one of the important missions for Foreign Minister Wang Yi is to somehow dissuade South Korea from further deepening its cooperation with Tokyo. So I think this is something that Seoul expects to hear from Wang Yi. But I think about the same time, Seoul would like to somehow use this occasion to obviously to relay a message through China to Kim Jong-un that it's ready to resume inter-Korean engagement. And I think this is the reason why the Blue House, the presidential office in South Korea, timed this announcement, the new unification doctrine, on the eve of the Minister Wang's visit to Seoul.
Right, so this latest visit could signal a lot of opportunities. Then, alongside this possible visit by Wang Yi, Seoul is also considering sending a delegation to Russia's Eastern Economic Forum as well. Dr. Berry, do you think Washington will view Korea's efforts to broaden its diplomatic engagement with China and Russia? What do you think, Washington, how would it view it?
I don't think it'll be too surprised. As long as relationship with the U.S. and with Japan is tight, which I see it continuing that way. And actually, it's a very good step for South Korea because certainly there'll be North Korean emissaries attending the Far Eastern Forum. And it's also quite possible that Kim Jong-un may meet Putin there or in that vicinity, as they have done in the past, maybe not attending the forum per se, but it'll be timed more or less with that visit. Although, to be honest with you, Kim Jong-un is still, yearning to be invited to Moscow, much like his dad and his grandfather, and it hasn't happened yet, and he feels maybe a little demeaned by that. But I think the chances of them meeting, let's say provisionally, with a Moscow visit in the future are very good for this September, and it's very good for South Korea to send its diplomats to that forum, which makes them more devoted participants in the processes for Northeast Asia.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's another angle to this, Dr. Go. Wang Yi visited Pyongyang in April. Then if he comes to Seoul by the end of this month, how do you think North Korea would watch this?
Well, I don't think North Korea will be concerned, at least for this time, because Wang Yi is coming to Seoul after President Xi of China visited Pyongyang in June. So clearly, if you look at the protocol level, President Xi ranks much higher than Minister Wang. So for North Korea, this is not an issue at all. So I think North Korea is going to be allow this to pass. And at the same time, we wouldn't be too concerned about what kind of a dialogue that could take place between Seoul and Beijing, because clearly President Xi went to North Korea, unlike the bilateral summitry between Seoul and Beijing, because it was actually the Korean president, Lee Jae-myung, who went to Beijing. So in terms of optics, it looks like North Korea has the upper hand compared to the South. And this was pretty much, very much by design on the part of China. So I think China meant to project this kind of optics to both Seoul and Pyongyang. And I think Pyongyang is probably right now highly flattered by this, because when you compare to North Korea and South Korea, Seoul, it doesn't really need to boost its prestige or confidence anymore by this kind of protocol games, whereas North Korea wants this badly. As Dr. Berry made a remark, North Korea is probably still hurt that, or Kim Jong-un is still hurt that he hasn't been invited to Moscow yet. So I think China knows how to handle each Korea, and knows which button to push. So I don't think Seoul is upset about this, and I think Pyongyang is happy. So China is actually pulled off a master move of keeping both Koreas happy at the same time.
Then what about the peacemaker, facemaker strategy, Dr. Go? Seoul has unveiled this. Do you think this approach could actually help in resuming U.S.-North Korea dialogue?
So I think the strategy is very sound, because it's all about somehow creating a framework to operationalize President Trump's, which is likely to be evaporating interest in engaging North Korea in direct dialogue. So this is essentially the only factor that engaging North Korea and the United States, at least indirectly. And I think South Korea wants to operationalize this before really fades away. So there are two parts to this policy. One is a declaratory policy. So there's the element, a component of a reassurance on the part of Seoul towards Pyongyang that it doesn't mean to absorb North Korea unify North Korea by absorption, but also there's a big element of respect accorded to North Korea. So it has essentially to change the language of cooperation. So whereas before South Korea would put on the table a major, massive economic assistance package in case North Korea needs it or responds to South Korea's engagement, now South Korea is using the term mutually beneficial cooperation. So essentially, South Korea is telegraphing to Pyongyang, it doesn't assume that North Korea is a needy party in this relationship, that North Korea and South Korea are equal partners in any kind of future endeavor. So this is essentially a sign of respect. Again, the game that China plays well in North Korea is now South Korea playing the same game in North Korea. And so I think this is a well thought out change of language on the part of South. But the second point is, in fact, the idea operationalizing the President Trump's desire or wish to engage the North. And this is being operationalized well because this framework includes not just the United States, but also China, because South Korea knows that it's very difficult for South Korea to engage North Korea directly. And also it's difficult for the United States to engage in North Korea directly because North Korea doesn't feel confident facing the United States alone. So it's looping in China as well. So this complex framework essentially offers a little bit of a positive return for everybody. And so I think this is a well thought out framework. But then fundamentally speaking, what's lacking here is North Korea, whether North Korea is going to respond to this. And I think this is going to could be part of the big chunk of the conversation that South Korea would have with visiting Foreign Minister Wang.
Right, so we'll really have to watch whether this could open the door for more dialogues moving forward. But I'm afraid we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Dr. Go, thank you so much for your insights.
Of course, my pleasure.
And of course, Dr. Barry, we really appreciate it.
Yes, great to be here today.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.